All right, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar. I am Dory Larson, the Electric Transportation Program Manager with the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, or SACE. Over the next hour, Tom Taylor of Atlas Public Policy and Stan Cross of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy will cover our highlights from our third annual Transportation Electrification in the Southeast report that was released today. A couple of technical items. We've saved time at the end of the webinar to answer questions. And during the presentation, you could submit your questions by clicking on the Q&A box and typing your question. We have quite a few attendees on the webinar today. So if your question does not get answered, please reach out to us following the webinar. We will provide contact information in the webinar follow-up email. And following the webinar, we will send a link to the recording. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Stephen Smith, our Executive Director of SACE, to kick us off.
Great. Thank you, Dory. And thank you, everyone, for joining. It's with great excitement that I'm proud to present the third annual Transportation Electrification in the Southeast report in partnership with Atlas Public Policy, great partner in putting these reports out. As many of you know, this is the fourth of an informative series that SACE does every year, looking at the other three are solar in the Southeast, energy efficiency, and decarbonization. And so we're really excited about this particular sector of work because it's literally red hot and advancing very, very quickly. And as many people know, since the last report, we've seen even more activity at the federal level. We've got the bipartisan infrastructure bill that has passed, and then very recently, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is actually providing even more support for this sector. And obviously, tens of billions of dollars of investment we're seeing in the region, tens of thousands of jobs. And so at SACE, we like to talk about the fact that we're actually becoming, as a nation and as a region, the clean energy generation. This is absolutely the right time to move forward. We have to move forward on these technologies, and the transportation sector is so absolutely critical because it is the one that is leading in carbon emissions. And if we're going to address climate disruption and the climate crisis, we have to tackle this sector. So there's good information that's going to be in this report. You're going to learn about both tremendous movement, but you're also going to learn about some real challenges because while we're seeing explosive growth in the Southeast in the supply chain, we're also seeing supply chain challenges that are going to have to be overcome. So with that, I look forward to the presenters. I'm going to turn it over to Stan Cross, who leads our Clean Transportation program. Stan?
Thanks, Steve, and welcome everybody to the webinar. Really excited to present this information to you today. Tom is going to take, from Atlas Public Policy, is going to take us through the data. He's the lead author on this report. But before I turn over to him, I just want to sort of contextualize a little bit about what you're going to be hearing today. The intent of these reports are to sort of capture what's happened the past 12 months and to look at that in the context of trends and to begin to think about what maybe need to be done in order to accelerate the positive trends and deal with any of the challenges that we're seeing in this space. And one thing in particular to pay attention to as Tom's going through the report is this duality in the Southeast, where we're seeing, a lot of investment, almost, over a third of all of the jobs nationwide in electric transportation are here in the Southeast. But we're also seeing the Southeast lagging in EV sales, charger deployment, utility investment, and public funding to date. And we recognize that the federal laws that are and bills that have been passed that are going to be bringing financial support for this sector are going to be transformative, but they're not going to be all that's needed. There's a lot more that needs to get done. And particularly what we're seeing in the Southeast is that, it's a moment where utilities and regulators in this vertically integrated, investor-owned utility dominant space here in the Southeast would be really wise to begin, to increase planning and preparation activities to get ready for, this rapid increase in electrification of both cars, trucks, and buses. So far, the uptake of EVs has been pretty slow and steady. But I think what you'll see in the report today is that that's accelerating really quickly. And with that is going to come challenges that the utilities are very capable of meeting, but that the planning needs to really begin today to make sure that that's a seamless experience. And at the same time, policymakers, in the Southeast would be wise to really begin thinking about what are the policies and programs to implement to really support these companies that are expanding in the region and continue to attract other companies by setting the conditions where this market can really thrive, and these businesses that are investing in the Southeast and bringing jobs to the Southeast can thrive as well. And the last point I want to highlight to think about as Tom's going through the report is that, equitable access remains, a critical problem to solve nationwide and here in the Southeast. Access to charging infrastructure, access to EV ownership, access to the public health benefits that come from transportation electrification and the elimination of tailpipe emissions, and access to the economic benefits, whether you're a consumer who can save money owning an EV or a fleet operator that can save money operating, a fleet of electric vehicles. These benefits are not currently equitably distributed. And so how we think about this federal funding, how we think about it trickling all the way down into our urban and rural communities, and how that funding and additional effort by utilities and policymakers can be done in a way that really centers equity and makes sure that everybody in the region has access to the benefits of electric transportation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom Taylor with Atlas Public Policy to take us through the report. Our intention is to use the first half hour of this report to kind of go through it and then open up the second half hour for Q&A. So as Dory said, if questions emerge while Tom's talking, just go ahead and use that Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll be capturing those questions and do our best to get to them all. So with that, take it away, Tom.
Thank you, Stan, and thanks to Stephen and Dory as well for getting us started. Before I get into any numbers, and before you question my credibility in this space, I'm not from the Southeast, but I do every day drink water from a cup, a Gator's cup, and so that I think gives me some credibility. To talk here, some very small credibility, but it's a pleasure to be here today and to talk through the report and hopefully keep it light, and then happy to take any questions you have at the end. And Stan has very graciously agreed to take all the difficult questions, and so I'll take the easy ones, which is nice. So the first thing is to just to quickly thank the SACE team. They were a pleasure to work with. They were a pleasure to work with last year and again this year. And even where report writing gets a little bit thorny, it is always really nice to work with them. And they always sort of keep it easygoing. So thank you to Stan and Kate and Dory. Also thanks to my team at Atlas Public Policy for all their help in pulling this together. These pieces are really big with many moving parts, and so it takes a lot of hands, so thank you to them. So to sort of look at the report as a whole, let's start with the states. We look at Alabama, Florida, Georgia, North and South Carolina, and Tennessee, and we look at a bunch of indicators. So Stan has gone through them already. I'll go through some more of the numbers, but you can think about these indicators in a couple of different ways. I think these indicators both talk about some of the key enablers of transportation electrification. So public funding, utility investment, that further upstream investment, if you like, and then all the way downstream to sales and charging deployment, what it looks like for consumers as they're joining this EV evolution that we're seeing. I don't think we need to go too much into it. If you're on this call, you probably know already about the key benefits here, but it's worth just noting that the why we do this. The decarbonization benefits are enormous given the carbon emissions from the transportation sector. The health benefits are also really consequential, and there's really important economic benefits as well that we'll see over the next coming years as we electrify transportation more. We, alongside these sort of 6 key indicators with numbers, we also look at medium and heavy duty. That is an emerging space, and it's exciting to see how that will shift over the next couple of years, especially with big investments at the federal level, and then policy developments. So how policy is helping or hindering uptake. We have, and just to sort of signpost this a little bit, we have the report. It's a 30-page report, and it is a nice breezy read, I think. And then we have these state one pages. So for each of the 6 states, they are a 1-page double side with some key highlights, and then a regional double-sider. And you can access them on the SACE website or also on the Atlas website. So in terms of the data that we'll be talking through today, the data is pulled through June 30, 2022, and it is sourced from Atlas EV Hub. This is a resource that pulls together a bunch of data on key EV indicators, and I encourage you to check it out. It is free for public agencies and clean cities coordinators. And so that's atlasevhub.com, and that is sort of the home for all this data. And if you have more questions about the data itself, that's a really good place to go. Or if you need to source data for yourself, that's a great hub. So let's get into the numbers. The first place to start is sales. So to note from the beginning, the sales that we track in this report are new light duty sales. And when we talk about EVs, we talk about battery electric vehicles. So that's vehicles that run purely on electricity, and then plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. So they will have a battery and then also can run on gasoline. And they are both under the umbrella of electric vehicles in this report and in these numbers. In the Southeast, we see a pretty significant uptick in EV sales. The data here, we're talking through market share, which I think is a really important indicator, that it says of all the new vehicles that have sold, light duty vehicles sold, how many of them in the most recent quarter were electric vehicles. And so we can see that in the region, 5% of all new light duty vehicles were EVs in Q2 2022. That is a really significant uptick from 2.5% 12 months earlier. So in Q2 2021, it was 2.5%. So it's doubled over 12 months, which is a massive improvement. And you can see that in the shape of the line here. What we also see, though, is that the Southeast still trails the national average, and that's that dotted line in black. And so part of what this report will do, and part of what efforts will do, is to work out what enablers need to fall in place for the Southeast to catch up to the rest of the country. When you break down the Southeast, though, it is there's very different stories in the region. So you can see from Florida, which has a 6% EV market share, to Alabama, which has a 2.1% EV market share, all in Q2. So that's April through June. You can see that that's a really significant range in EV market share across the states. And so we have very different stories in the region. We see part of the reason is that there are more models available than ever for buyers in the region, and I think that's a really key part of the story, that people have more options than 12 months ago or before. And I think it's worth noting that we are seeing all this uptick even amidst supply chain headwinds. And so in many places, it's really difficult to find an EV or vehicles more generally. And so it's worth sort of situating these numbers in that context. We'll keep moving onto the manufacturing jobs and investment data. So a note on this data, these numbers are all anticipated. So we take them from, say, Hyundai. They will provide estimates for the number of jobs and the amount of investment in a state, and we report that number. That's not to say that those jobs will eventuate or that necessarily the quality of those jobs, but that's our best indicator at the moment about what kind of jobs we will see. So the Southeast great strength, as has been mentioned, is in EV manufacturing. It makes up more than a third of the country's EV manufacturing jobs will be in the Southeast. And so what that means is that there's more than also nearly $33 billion in investment and more than 40,000 anticipated jobs to come to the Southeast. This is looking at manufacturing jobs only. The scale of these projects is also really significant. So to take a couple of examples, the first two on the list here, Hyundai and Rivian are both, at the time of investment, were both touted as the largest economic development jobs in the state at that time. So Rivian was, and then Hyundai beat that record a couple of months later. And so the scale, depending on how you want to count that pledge, but the scale of these projects is really massive, both in terms of the investment and then in terms of the jobs to come to the state. The sort of a question to watch is, how will IRA shift the manufacturing landscape in the Southeast? So I think it's exciting to see, the result of the EV tax credit and a real emphasis on manufacturing in the Act. It will be exciting to see the result of that on the region. And given that the region has established itself as a really strong hub for EV manufacturing, the question will be, is it able to consolidate that with more onshoring of EV jobs and the growth of medium and heavy duty EV jobs? So that is sort of an interesting space to watch. Next, we move on to utilities. So Stan mentioned that we are looking at investor-owned utilities. It's important to note that there are other utilities around the country. Around 70% of people are served by investor-owned utilities. So it's not the whole picture, but it's a really good part of the picture where we can get a sense about what utilities are up to. And we see in the Southeast that the region represents about 10% of all approved investments from investor-owned utilities around the country. So that around the country, we've seen $3.55 billion in approved investments by these IOUs. And in the Southeast, it's around $336 million in approved funding. The what we've done this year that I think is new and important is to look at these investments on a per customer basis. So how do we measure the success of these investments? One way of getting close to that is looking at investment on a per customer basis. All utilities in the Southeast, trail the national average of $43 per customer. But what we see in the Southeast is that there's a really different story between the top 2 utilities, so 2 Florida utilities, and then the rest of the utilities in the Southeast. I think that there is a question that Stan primed earlier around IOUs bridging the gap with national investment. There's also a question I have about whether or not some of these other utilities in the Southeast will bridge the gap with the lead utilities and at least get closer to the national average and lift their levels of investment there. So that's sort of one thing to watch. Next, to look at charging deployment. So we, for this tracking, we look at level 2 and DCFC charging. So that's direct current fast charging. And that includes public charging and semi-private charging. So where you have charging in a hotel, for instance, that is counted in these numbers. And it also includes proprietary chargers like a Tesla charger. So what we try to do is to map the Southeast and see how it compares to the rest of the country. And so you can see that, again, there's a really different story by state in the Southeast. You have this cluster of states at the top, and then you have South Carolina sort of somewhere in the middle, and then Tennessee and Alabama trailing the top couple of states. Again, though, the important story is that all states trail the national average. And so the question will be, how do we ensure that drivers in the Southeast have access to good, reliable public charging in the region as uptake grows? I think the other challenge is ensuring that the charging is accessible and it's affordable. So we know that charging at home is cheaper than public charging. And so for those who are more reliant on public charging, particularly those low-income families or communities that are more reliant on public charging, it's really critical that they do not pay extra for that because they don't have that benefit of charging at home. And so that's a crucial equity question to come as we see broader swath of the community driving EVs. How do we make sure that it's affordable for all and doesn't exacerbate inequalities? It's also important that EV charging is reliable. So when you go to a public charger, that you can be confident that it works, and that charging is situated in communities that need it. So where we have perhaps less availability of public charging at home, say in areas with high multi-unit dwelling, high density living, those communities need access to public charging. And so it's important that there's equitable distribution that takes that into account. So the next part of the report is looking at policies. We note that there are both enabling policies and that there are policies that function as putting the handbrake on progress. So to start with some of the handbrakes, there are challenges around direct sales in the Southeast. In a number of states, it is difficult to EV only manufacturers are not able to sell directly to consumers. There have to be sort of workarounds, and it's very fiddly. Similarly, challenges with servicing vehicles. And so how do we ensure that that people have access to EVs, not just that they're affordable, not just that they can charge them, but that the buying experience in the first place is more straightforward. The other piece is that we see quite high levels of EV fees in the Southeast. These fees are put in place as EVs don't pay gas taxes, but they are quite high, and they are especially high in the Southeast. So just as we have incentives at a federal level to help people buy EVs, taxes at a state level that make it harder to buy EVs or more expensive to keep an EV, that counteracts those the benefits that governments and other institutions are trying to put in place. In Georgia has the second highest EV fee in the country, and Alabama has some of the highest EV fees in the country. Alabama's, I think, is $200, and Georgia's is $214 a year. And so that really adds up over the lifetime of a vehicle and just adds significant extra financial burden on EV drivers. That said, there are positive developments. So the advanced clean truck rulemaking in North Carolina appears to be gathering some steam in that state, and has been adopted elsewhere around the country to electrify trucks. And that is a really key development to not just to reduce emissions, but also given the equity and environmental justice impacts of where medium and heavy duty trucks are traveling through, and who is exposed to that pollution. There are also local level initiatives, and so where we're not necessarily seeing leadership from the state, or sometimes to complement leadership from the state, local level governments are putting in place a range of initiatives or targets or policy supports to help people adopt EVs. And so the city of Charlotte in North Carolina has set a target for 100% EVs by 2030 for the city fleets. I think that's right. I just need to double check, but they've set a target, and in doing so, have sort of helped other cities to realize that that's possible for them also. The question I think that is really interesting in this space will be how the large industry presence in the Southeast shifts the policy dynamic. So we've talked already about the Rivians or the VinFast or the whoever else of the world that are situating in the Southeast. And so how will the presence of these big manufacturers encourage these states to revisit some of these policies and to look at more supportive policies, so that the Southeast is not just a hub for manufacturing, but the people who are making these vehicles may also drive these vehicles and can afford to access these vehicles and supported to do that. I think that will be a crucial question moving forward. The next piece, and I think this is a very I shouldn't play favorites, but this may be my favorite graphic in the paper. So we look at the existing public funding for EV charging today, and then we put it alongside the NEVI funding. So for a quick refresh, NEVI is the funding from the bipartisan infrastructure law. It is just the $5 billion chunk. There's another $2.5 billion chunk to support community and other zero emission vehicle charging. But this is just that $5 billion that's allocated by formula funding to states. So they get an allocated amount. And we can see that when you compare the public EV funding the public funding for EV charging to date in green, compared with the NEVI funding that is allocated to these states, there's just a really massive step change in funding to come that will mean that open up real new sort of landscape in terms of EV charging for users. So I think it's very exciting to see how this will play out. Across the region, there will be $680 million allocated to the Southeast. The question to me will be, what are the ways in which this NEVI funding and the availability of public charging will change the game in the Southeast? You know, the availability, you know, seeing more charging around, feeling more confident about getting around, you know, the ubiquity of charging, particularly on these key corridors. How will that change the landscape in the Southeast? And you know, it's just a really crucial time moving forward, and this NEVI funding is just massive. When you put it side by side, it will change things dramatically. I'm almost out of time, so I'll just quickly go through, I think, my last slide. So the last sort of part of the puzzle will be medium and heavy duty electrification. This space is still growing, and so we watch it keenly, but we're seeing more and more, particularly electric school buses, but also electric trucks roll out. And it's exciting to see this part of the fleet, as I mentioned, electrify also. The question I think that will be crucial to watch will be a lot of the funding from these federal laws is competitive funding. And so yeah, is the Southeast able to compete for that funding? Is it able to, you know, provide match funding where required? Does it make a priority to go after that funding to electrify school buses, transit buses, other medium and heavy duty vehicles? That sort of remains to be seen, but I think it's a really interesting question and one that we will watch moving forward. So they're the slides that I have. Feel free to get in touch. I know we'll get into some questions here, but feel free to get in touch with Stan or myself if you have particular questions. And the report is on the SACE website and the Atlas website. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, thanks so much, Tom, for that great synopsis of the report. So we are going to go now into some questions that we received during your presentation. And the first one is, let's start off with, can you speculate on why there has been such a massive increase in EV charging ports since the last report?
Yeah, the speculation probably stands better at speculation. I think we are seeing across each of these indicators, you know, an uptick in over the past 12 months. So it's not necessarily surprising to me. I think especially as EV adoption grows and as you know, private companies and as state governments can see the demand, they are matching that demand in terms of EV growth. It's also worth noting that the baseline is pretty small still for EV charging in the Southeast. So I think there's still a long way to go in terms of charging, and but it's a good first step.
Yeah, and what I would add to that is you know, whenever, I think this is important to keep in mind with the federal funding that's coming, is that whenever pots of money are created to support charging infrastructure, there's an inherent lag time in getting that money to actually result in a charger on the ground. And so I think in the Southeast, a lot of the Volkswagen settlement funding that has supported EV charging took a couple of years to go through the process of actually standing up programs at the state level, creating the RFPs, getting the contracts awarded, and actually getting the installation done. So I think we're starting to see some of the end result of that work. And I think we'll see a similar thing with the NEVI funding that's coming to support fast charging along highway corridors, is that it's going to take time before that money actually results in charging stations deployed. There are real constraints to getting the infrastructure on the ground. Everything from on the utility side, needing to do upgrades to transformers, and it takes time to get those transformers ordered and delivered. Same thing on the charger side, as well as sort of issues on the ground around getting things permitted, and just getting the work completed. So I would speculate that we'll see, we won't really see the growth from the bipartisan infrastructure law funding in next year's report as much as we will in the following year, when we'll likely see a significant uptick that will result in that work being accomplished.
Very good. All right, so this next question I'm going to kind of combine two from Ed McInnigan and David Borax with WFA Charlotte. So they're asking how the Southeast stacks up if you break California out of the rest of the nation in terms of where the Southeast fits in, and then also can you offer a comparison of EV adoption versus the nation and other regions across the country?
Yeah, I can start, and again, Stan, you can mop up, but it's true. California is sort of head and shoulders above the rest of the country. I don't have the number here in front of me in terms of what the average looks like when you take California out, but given its population and given the fact that in Q1, don't quote me on this number, but California had around 18% market share for EVs. That's just a massive number and is going to pull up the rest of the country. So yeah, I can pull those numbers, but I think it's a fair observation that California lifts the rest of the country. To the second question around the regions, we also didn't do a region by region comparison, but that is something that we can do. The part of this though is you can look at states. We did this to look at states' EV market share compared to the rest of the country, and you can see that at least Alabama, maybe South Carolina as well, are in the bottom bunch of states for EV market share, and so we can break that down, more fully if that is helpful.
Yeah, and I'll just add that when we have taken California out of the equation and looked at national averages with California gone, what we've seen is that, Georgia and Florida will kind of edge up towards or kind of be close to that national average, both for, market share, but also for EV charger deployment, where the rest of the Southeast states are still below national average, even with California taken out. So I think it's a fair question, and we'll actually be publishing outside of the report a graphic that will try and make sense of that, because it is a complicated metric to pay attention to, and I think it is important to think about that from an apples to apples comparison. At the same time, I think that it's important to recognize that the reasons why California is so far out ahead of the rest of the country. I think that gets to the point of, what are those enabling policies that are being passed there that are accelerating the market? Though they may not all apply to our region, there may be pieces of the regulatory landscape in California that we can look to bring to the Southeast, like the Advanced Clean Truck Rule, for example, that can really help pull the region forward, not just towards, but beyond those national averages.
Very good. I have a question about the jobs created estimate. Are they based on manufacturer announcements? They also are noting in their question that Volkswagen was not mentioned in Tennessee. So if you could talk to what that wasn't included.
Yeah, they are manufacturer announcements. would need to just double check. There's a bunch of reasons why it might not have been included. So I might just check numbers depending on when the announcement was. A piece is announced, but they don't designate the number of EV specific jobs or the EV manufacturing investment amount. They just designate an amount for the facility. And in that case, we can't report a number because we don't have an EV number. So I'll need to double check that and get back to you.
You're muted.
Dory.
Yeah.
Sorry, we're in the middle of a lightning storm, so I'm trying to mute in between. So here's a question drilling down into Georgia. What is Georgia doing right that other states can learn from?
I'll go ahead and start with that one. I think that, Georgia is a really interesting state to look at, because back in, 2014, 2015 timeframe, Georgia put in place a state tax credit. So it was a state tax credit on top of the federal tax credit. And that took Georgia from sort of one of the bottom EV adoption states right up to the top. And that generated a lot of activity in Georgia, because suddenly there were a lot of those early generation EVs on the road. When that tax credit went away, the sales of EVs dropped dramatically and have since, kind of been steadily increasing at a similar rate to the rest of the region. But the sheer number of consumers that got in the game early, and kind of what that led to in terms of charging station deployment and just broad awareness of electrification in Georgia, I think is really telling. Currently, from a manufacturing standpoint, I think Georgia's just done a phenomenal job attracting investment. It's been a priority of the governor, of the legislature, and also of the economic development arm of the state. And they've got a lot of attributes that they can make use of, from the port in Savannah to really strong incentive packages for those companies to expand and locate in Georgia. Similarly, Tennessee and North Carolina are also doing really good jobs attracting those manufacturers and those jobs. So I don't think it's just a Georgia play. It really is all three of those states are currently kind of on top of their game. And I think, Alabama and South Carolina have a lot of potential to really rise up and capture a lot of this opportunity as well.
Great. Another question, what are some commitments from the auto industry to promote EVs?
Yeah, okay. It can go in a bunch of different directions. So let me offer a couple and then Stan fill in. But we see these sort of lofty high-level commitments from automakers. And so we've seen from GM, for instance, that they have pledged to stop selling gasoline vehicles by 2030 something. Let's double check that. Likewise, Ford have a commitment to stop selling gasoline vehicles, I think, in Europe, and have a commitment to wind down the sale in the United States. I'm not sure if they've committed to fully phasing it out. I don't think so, but so there's those high-level commitments. The next level is they can commit to facilities, so building out facilities. I think that's a really crucial development, as it means that they are able to, they support jobs, that they have a presence in the state, and also that they sort of demystify EVs. When you have EVs being built in your community or in your state, it normalizes these things that are, that they are part of your community, and that they are that they work and that they don't blow up when you turn them on. And then the third thing that they can do and that they have done is, softer stuff. So I saw an initiative recently, I'm forgetting the name, but it sort of goes through key misconceptions about EVs. You can call in or chat them or whatever, and you can ask them about your questions about EVs, and they can help dispel myths about EVs and answer any questions you may have. So I think that they have, a bunch of different roles to play in this space. There's other stuff. These are big companies, and so they'll be operating in a bunch of different ways, but they have a really significant role. And I think, it's promising to see movement from these automakers that are making commitments to EVs. And so it's just important now to track that and to make sure that we know where they're falling short, or that we know what's going on with those commitments.
Yes, let me offer the flip side of that coin, which is sort of what have automakers been lagging on in terms of really incentivizing this market. And I think, what we're seeing is that, we really need EVs at affordable price points. And so, there's been this sort of skew to produce more expensive, more luxurious, more tech-filled vehicles, as opposed to, kind of looking at that kind of mid-range or lower range new vehicle purchase price. So I think that's something that we're hoping that the dollars that are flowing through the Inflation Reduction Act will help stimulate. There's a lot of manufacturing tax credits. There's a lot of opportunities within that bill to really accelerate battery production domestically, which will hopefully drive down costs. So I think that's a challenge for EV companies, and we're seeing some start to move in that direction. I think General Motors is really looking to lead. They recently dropped the sticker price of their Chevy Bolt down to the low 20,000s to try and kind of fill in this sort of void in the space. I think secondly, marketing these vehicles. I think there hasn't been, an aggressive or an effective marketing campaign yet run by automakers who are incredible marketers. And when they really start to sort of back up these goals and these manufacturing commitments with really strong marketing campaigns, it's going to be really helpful in the education and outreach that needs to happen and that many of us are engaged in to try to get consumers excited about the technology and willing to really, look at it deeply. And then that leads to the third, which is the, deployment of these vehicles on showroom floors and dealership lots across the country. There are swaths of the country where there are not a lot of EVs or any at all on dealer lots. And so as consumers get educated and as they get interested in the vehicles, making sure that the production is sort of keeping up with demand and that those vehicles are being made available, again, sort of equitably across the landscape so that consumers all feel like and genuinely have access to purchasing these vehicles. That's complicated because it involves the auto dealers and the automakers. It's not just an automaker responsibility, but making those vehicles widely accessible, I think is gonna be a really important objective for automakers to rise up and meet.
Thanks, Dan. So here's a question, speaking of some constraints. Do you expect constraints on mining capacity for critical battery minerals to slow down the pace of electric vehicle adoption in the coming years?
I can have a go. I think I would be much richer and in a much better apartment than this if I could predict where that market is going. But what I do think is, or what we do know is that we can have what we're hearing from automakers and what we're seeing from analysts, that people have concerns about supply chain challenges. That in particular, that they have concern about some of these key critical minerals, and making sure that they have, sourcing locked in for those critical minerals. So a couple of things there. I think it's important to see how quickly the market can innovate where you have challenges. One example that sticks out is cobalt. We know that sourcing cobalt has a pretty egregious track record, and really disturbing human rights violations. And so what we're seeing, and it's expensive. And so what we're seeing from automakers, there was reporting from Bloomberg recently that the percentage of cobalt in batteries is dropping quite significantly, quite quickly, and that DOE and others have targeted, Department of Energy and others have targeted removing cobalt entirely from batteries by over the next couple of years. And so we'll see a bunch of innovation in that space, and hopefully move away from some of the really difficult to source and the really problematic critical minerals. But that said, there will still be challenges in this space in sourcing those critical minerals. And I think it's a very live challenge for the industry to confront.
Yeah, I think Tom's absolutely right. And we should expect challenges, and we should, really be encouraging that innovation. And I think we should also be making sure that we seize this opportunity, that while we transition away from an oil-based transportation dependency, which itself has a tremendous amount of challenges up and down the supply chain, and a lot of impacts on human rights and public health, as we transition to electric transportation, that we don't just carry on with those human rights and environmental degrading realities, right? And that we seize this moment to do it differently. And I'm really inspired by the sort of intent of the Inflation Reduction Act to really onshore a lot of our battery manufacturing and processing. And I'm also emboldened by automakers investing in mining companies and battery production companies, because together that's beginning to create a different level of accountability, right? As we onshore production and processing, our more stringent environmental and hopefully our more intentional cultural and social policies will stand strong, and we'll make sure that people and ecosystems are not harmed, or that whatever harm is done is minimal. And now that we have automakers investing in the supply chain, their brand is attached to these activities, and so they're going to be very eyes on how these processes are unfolding, to make sure that they don't wind up in a situation where things are happening on the ground that don't align with their values as a company. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity. There's certainly a lot of challenges, but we're going to have to be very intentional and pay really close attention to how this transition occurs, to make sure we don't inherit the problems of the past.
Yeah, and Stan, I just wanted to also jump in that the IRA has that incentive package where roughly half of the federal incentive is tied to that sourcing and that onshoring that you're talking about, prioritizing certain countries over others. And I think there still is a lot of trying to sort out those specifics, and I think there's going to be some confusion for a period of time in that space. And so I think that's further going to complicate it. But I think the overall intent of moving some of that onshore and particularly into North America is going to be really valuable. But it's going to be tricky, and so we're gonna have to watch that. And then it's also going to be critically important that the battery recycling industry really takes off, because that's going to be the best source of all this material ultimately. And you see people like Redwood Materials and everybody else that are really sort of kicking that off in a big way. But we're going to have challenges from an environmental point of view, because there are going to be the increased mining activities in areas, and we're already starting to see that in the Southeast. So as Stan was saying, we have to be sensitive to it, but we've got to make the transition, because the do nothing option sort of supports the offshore drilling and all the other sourcing that we see that already has the devastation we're dealing with.
Thanks, Steve. All right. We have time for 2 more questions if we keep the answers somewhat brief. This question is about making sure or addressing the rural areas, and wondering if or what is needed to support utilities providing power to rural areas.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, in the Southeast, where, we recognize the geography of a number of urban centers with large swaths of rural landscape between, and when we look at where charging infrastructure has been deployed and where EV sales are happening, it's not in those rural landscapes. We also recognize that to date, there hasn't been vehicle types that align well with the kind of vehicles that those rural communities typically purchase, either as consumers or as public or private fleets. So as we see, pickup trucks and vans and SUVs kind of coming online, I think that there's a lot of opportunity. And so how states kind of work with their electric member co-ops and their municipal utilities that service a lot of those rural landscapes, and how investor-owned utilities are sort of held accountable by regulators to making sure that investments are spread out equitably across landscapes, I think is going to be really critical to getting the infrastructure in place that's necessary to support the EV ecosystem. I also think there's a lot of education outreach that needs to be done kind of from within rural communities to really kind of open up folks to the sort of realization of what EVs can bring to those communities. Because ironically, in rural communities, people typically drive longer distances than they do in the more urban communities, which means owning an EV is an even greater benefit, because the more you drive it, the more you save, because you're deferring, that expensive gasoline and you're replacing it with cheaper electricity. So I think there's a lot of education awareness needs to happen. There's also a lot of work that needs to be done in support of electric member co-ops and municipal utilities kind of really being able to meet the demand.
Thanks, Dan. All right, here's our last question. Looking ahead and thinking about our report next year, what are you most interested in? What are you keeping a close eye on?
Okay, I will have 2 things if you'll let me, Dory. So the first one is one of the questions I posed, which is, when we have this sort of massive growth in manufacturing that is, I think, would just keep growing with IRA, how will that change the dynamics in these states, policy-wise, from public funding perspective, from an uptake perspective? I think that's a really interesting and exciting driver of change. And so that's one question that I'm keen to watch. The other question I think that is scattered throughout the report is we need to look more closely at equity and ensuring that people have access to affordable EVs, have access to affordable charging, that people have access to cleaner air, and that access is really intentional about who it targets. So we know, Black and brown communities are more exposed to air pollution. And so how do we design programs and ensure that benefits flow to those communities, and that they're not left behind, or that they're not left with more expensive or more challenging workarounds to get some of the benefits of transportation electrification?
Yeah, well, I think Tom nailed it. So, so I think we'll let it end there, and I'll go ahead and just wrap us up and just thank again everybody for being here. As we said earlier, the questions that we didn't get a chance to answer, if you could follow up with those questions, that would be really appreciated. You can email them to myself or Tom, either one, and we will get answers to you quickly. And also, when you go into, this report it has a lot of really good information in it. So I really recommend that folks take the time to read it. We've given a very kind of high level overview of what's in it, but there's a lot more. So dig in. I hope you enjoy it. And yeah, thanks for being here. Have a great rest of your day.